Hello and welcome to A Spiritual Guide to Politics. I am Liz Philippos, and I'm here to offer an expanded perspective into this moment in our collective political lives so that we come to a deeper awareness of our capacity to transform and transcend the present paradigm as agents of transformation. Each week I talk with creative leaders about their spiritual understanding of the current political moment, the possibilities for the well-being of our planetary lives, and the life of the planet itself. They inspire us to know that the personal is political and the political is spiritual. There are tremendous possibilities for transformation when we really come to know this. My guest today is Shakil Choudhry. Shakil is an award-winning educator and consultant with more than 20 years' experience in the field of diversity. He has trained senior leaders and developed measurement tools for organizations, helping improve their diversity outcomes. Internationally, Shakil has designed and led peace-building projects for communities in conflict, especially in Europe and South America. He's deeply engaged with the questions of inclusion and diversity, especially the challenges that we're facing today in terms of the extreme polarization that we're experiencing. Welcome, Shakil. I'm really interested in the work that you're doing as a diversity trainer. Today, this is a particularly challenging profession that you're in, and I wonder if you could talk about some of the challenges that you are experiencing.
There's one central problem. It's captured by many conversations. The one that stands out for me is right after the shooting of Trayvon Martin. The mayor of this predominantly white town said, before this shooting, I didn't think there was any kind of a race problem in our town. Black folks and folks of color who lived there in Sanford, no, that problem's always been here. That conversation is the issue. You've got millions of people on one part of the equation saying, look, we experience racism, discrimination, and prejudice and bias on a regular basis. Millions of people on the other side of the equation can't see that this is happening. And I'm not talking about the ones that are in full denial of it or don't even care about it. Generally, it's this gap between people who experience discrimination and people who don't understand that it's happening or question if it is or wonder if it's about how a person was dressed or how they looked or if they said the wrong thing. And I think that's the central crisis. And the conversations that we're trying to have around racism and systemic discrimination and oppression, they're a train wreck. We are basically unruly beginners in this process. And I don't think that the weight of that is equally distributed, but I'd say that the conversations cycle over and over and over again. That's the tragedy. And I'd say that's the heart of the work that I'm doing, both in organizations as well as communities on the ground.
Part of the work or the initial work is to even have people recognize that there is a systemic problem, that incidences of racism or sexism or other kinds of bias are not isolated or discrete or individualized, but there is a pattern that you're trying to show people or demonstrate to people before you can even address the problem.
There's decades and decades of research that indicates there are gaps, and that the gaps are cross-cutting. They're regardless of income and class and what neighborhoods you live in. Race is a factor, gender is a factor, sexual orientation is a factor, what disability is a factor, what we look like, the bodies we are in are factors. Research has shown for such a long time that it's the social identities, it's the group identities. And that's the problem. There's a systemic problem, and so many people can't see it. If we happen to come from the groups that are dominant, we see it less. That is the systemic nature of it.
Yeah, and that's the nature or the relationship of privilege. That's
right.
Part of privilege is that you don't have to see it because it's not part of your daily lived experience. But it is in another way, even if I'm of the privileged population, and my whole society is divided and fragmented, even if it seems like I'm not being impacted. I live in a divided and fragmented society. Surely that has an impact on my well-being.
Absolutely. Everyone is affected by unfairness. People who benefit from the unfairness as well as people who are impacted by the unfairness. Everybody is absolutely affected. When we come from the oppressed groups, the marginalized groups, the minority groups, the results are kind of obvious. They're at least obvious if we're experiencing them, and they're really obvious if you look at data. And so the negative impacts are obvious. But when we come from a place of privilege, the things that we don't realize when our group is in charge is that, in fact, we're actually kind of fragile because our identity muscles haven't been worked out. And when we come from a dominant position, when our group is in charge, we're going to get criticized. People are going to call us out or call our group out for not paying attention. And then we get really reactive because it's A, emotional, and B, we don't have experience with it. So as a result, the term white fragility is certainly being used. And I'd say it's fragility amongst any dominant group that we're in charge of, whether it's male fragility when men are called out around their gender privilege, or white fragility when it's about racism. It's actually a lack of experience. For example, when we're looking at issues of race, most people who are racial minorities will have experienced some aspects of discrimination from the time they're a really young age. And the darker our skin, the more likely we'll have experienced it. And so being that outsider, remarkably, starts building a muscle that gets stronger. Just like, when we work out, our muscles get stronger through micro tears. It's the same thing that happens. The day-to-day micro inequities, microaggressions, remarkably allow people from minority groups to see what others can't see, what the dominant groups can't see, and it actually strengthens people because they're having to work out muscles that people from the dominant group aren't.
Right.
So, and the ways that internalized dominance then shows up also has a whole host of impacts for people that they can't see.
You're reminding me of a lot of feminist theory that talks about that, about the view from below standpoint kind of feminism, or from outside of the center, that we have a better grasp of how power works because we're not so implicated in it. And, the thing about identity that you're saying, it seems to me that it's really come up, that fragility that you're referring to has really come up since the last election. We're seeing in the U.S., we're seeing quite an expression of fragility.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I don't think it's been just from the last election. I think it's been building up. And certainly I'd say that, when Obama was elected, that's where we really saw the fragility show up, the fear show up, the defensiveness, the anger show up with, people like from the Tea Party movement and things like that. Mm-hmm. And that's only continued. And so here we are, and it is definitely a time which is a real threat for democracy. Polarization is actually the threat to democracy. Researchers that study authoritarianism around the world have definitely found that the death to democracy is not like a big bang, but it happens through all these small and subtle ways. And especially, it's when things become so polarized that people can't talk anymore. People become so polarized and entrenched in their positions, they become the enemy. And so the extreme polarization is the problem. And it's something that I think is actually even a bigger problem than racism, sexism, oppression, all the different things put together, because if democracy breaks, and I mean like breaks in forms of like extreme civil unrest, all bets are off at that point. At that point, there are no ground rules anymore. There's no contracts anymore. One of the things that we've also got to do is beware of that we've got to do our work and we've got to keep pushing for justice and for fairness, but also be aware that polarization and our ability to support polarization because we feel so much injustice is happening, that we've got to be careful because we might be sowing the seeds for conflicts that we can't get past, things that whatever solutions we're creating, that we use the framework that really comes from First Nations communities, which is the idea of the 7 generations. Whatever choices we're making today, can we think about the impact that are going to be generations from now, and specifically 7 generations from now? I think that also invites folks on the left and progressives to also start thinking about what's our contribution to the polarization, and how can we also help the problem and help slow it down and fix it, or are we just contributing to it? And I think this is where all the mindfulness work comes in. This is where also us being able to manage ourselves come in. Otherwise, unregulated anger, deregulated activists can also contribute to the very problems we're trying to fix.
It's an important point to raise and to note. So what is it when we think about left-wing progressive movements who are seeking justice, seeking fairness, seeking dignity, seeking recognition? You've outlined a comprehensive practical approach that you call deep diversity. Could you talk a bit about that? And what's the difference, deep diversity versus diversity training?
That's a great question. I think diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism, anti-oppression, cultural competence, all of these things are talking about similar things that we're trying to accomplish. They're all coming at it in different ways. At the heart of the work around systemic change is understanding the impact of our identity on each other and on the world around us, understanding how power dynamics work. So the idea of deep diversity is saying, well, we got to get past just the theories, and we've also got to move towards practice that's relational, practice that acknowledges power and acknowledges power dynamics and the impact of context and identity, and is rooted in strengthening relationships. And first and foremost, it's about strengthening relationships with ourselves and understanding how we work, both the conscious dimensions and the unconscious dimensions. This is where the work of neuroscience and psychology all really help. And both of those things, psychology, neuroscience, is really missing from traditional social justice approaches. Generally, traditional social justice approaches are not psychologically based. They're based in historical and sociological models. We're really important models and really have helped us understand why there's such divisions. But there's also the psychological, like what's happening inside us. And that's what the deep diversity model says. And says, look, if we want to have a conversation about systemic discrimination, something like racism, what we've got to be able to do is look at 4 dimensions that are invisible. We've got to look at the emotions and how they're invisible and controlling. We've got to look at bias, which is unconscious bias, a kind of prejudice that all humans have. We've got to look at the idea of tribes or identities, how social identities create in-groups and out-groups, how this dynamic between in-groups and out-groups is universal wherever we go. And then we've got to look at power, socioeconomic, historical, political, all these kind of things. What's common amongst all 4 of these parts of the deep diversity framework, emotions, bias, tribes, and power, is some parts are visible at the conscious level, most are invisible and are hidden. And what's hidden has more power. What we can't see has more influence. But when we can identify it, when we can name it, we can also tame it. That work really starts with ourselves. What we've got to do is recognize that as we are attempting to fix the brokenness that exists out there in the world, we've also got to fix the brokenness that's within each of us, the hurt places. And if we don't, those hurt places actually control us. I know that your show is bringing together activism and mindfulness. What I would say is to the activist listeners, when we can't recognize that our own brokenness is driving us, then so much of dysfunction that is out there in the world resides within us and then in our relationships. I come from activist community, and over time I've gotten to learn that polarization, toxicity, egos, power plays, all that stuff exists within progressive organizations and progressive movements. It's part of my job as both a consultant and a trainer, and I work with all kinds of progressive organizations, whether it's unions, environmental organizations, social justice organizations, whatever they might be. And the problems are very common. Same kind of issues that exist in mainstream organizations exist within us. And so we've got to look at that. That plays out within our communities. What hope do we have of bridging across the incredibly big gaps when we can't even do it within our own progressive communities? And so that's why it's got to start with us. It's got to start with looking internally and being aware of who we are and how we are and what's driving us, both consciously as well as unconsciously.
Because most of the bias is unconscious and, like you say, coming from woundedness. a sense of being victimized and seeking some kind of compensation in terms of social power.
Yeah, that's right.
It seems like a challenging thing to ask people to do in workplaces and organizations to create a more harmonious environment. To do that, it's deep inner work to go into our brokenness, isn't it?
It is. In the context of organizations, in the context of our lives, it is hard to do. However, the center pin of all the work is actually, for me, rooted in compassion and in love. And first of all, self-compassion, right? Because a lot of us, especially doing social change work, we're really hard on ourselves. We're really, really hard on ourselves. And as a result, we're frequently really hard on other people. And so my suggestion is that we've got to come at this with the idea that, yes, let's look at the problems. And yes, also, let's be able to look at the solutions. Let's be able to acknowledge the brutality that exists in the world, because it is brutal. Mass incarceration is brutal. And if that's all we see, then it's really hard to get up the next morning. It's really hard to keep going. We need to also feed ourselves by understanding that there's beauty in the world. We need to be able to support ourselves by also being in connection with others and finding ease and moments of respite and of relaxation, just being able to take the moments to also breathe, take the moments to just feel our bodies, take the moments to allow goodness to come in and love from our families and our surroundings and the natural world. And those are ways that we can also replenish ourselves in order to continue this struggle, a struggle that is intergenerational, a struggle that the work of equity is it's not a sprint, it's an ultra marathon that spans generations. And so we're here because of all the work that came before us. The baton's in our hands, and now we do what we can with it, and then we're going to pass it on. And hopefully we've made a little bit of difference somewhere in the world, and hopefully we've made some difference in ourselves as well. And so that's the way I think about this work.
So what I'm hearing is that on one hand, there's something of the human condition that we're engaging with, that we're addressing when we're talking about diversity in workplaces or harmony in national context, that there's a human condition that we have dominion over. We have a choice over how we see each other and who we call part of our circle of belonging. The work that we do is internal, a mindfulness turned inside, a self-compassion, a self-care, and a connection to something that is universal, like beauty. Because I'm hearing that there's something more true about us than our divisions. There's something more real about us that is in beauty, that is in connection, than the divisions that we see around us.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's a lot of research that says, as much as there's conflict seems to be a big part of the human condition, there's actually research that says cooperation's a bigger part of our nature, and humans are quite incredible. We're some of the few species that can cooperate beyond kin, beyond bloodlines. Yeah, I'd say that there's a lot of things to be hopeful about, but that's not to be naive. I would say that we don't have to be lost in the either-or dynamic. We don't have to be naive and pretend like there aren't problems, but we can also show up in a different way and work towards justice in a way that is also sustainable, allows us to be there in the long term. And one of the things that happens a lot in social change communities is burnout, activist burnout. And I think it's ultimately linked to how we do the work. And I say that from experience because part of the reason that I've done this work differently is because I burnt out. I burnt out in my early 30s and had to go through a real healing process, and one that, is unfinished. I don't think we ever heal. We just get better than maybe we were once we are willing to touch those broken places and work with them. Mm-hmm. But I'd say that that's also changed the work because I'm like, I'm not naive, but I am hopeful. And I think some of that is because I've been willing to do some of that work, some of that internal work. And I'd say that's what I invite our social change makers into, which is why I think the show you're doing is important, too, is bringing together these pieces of both mindfulness as well as social change and justice. That's an important thing.
I know that from your story, from your biography, that you've come into the work of reconciling differences and harmonizing societies because you had the experience of being othered and carried a lot of those wounds of a racialized experience. I appreciate that you're speaking from your experience of having started on a process of mindful healing, that doing that inner work. So you're not just telling us from an academic understanding, that's your real lived experience, and that matters in this conversation. Is this what you would say is spiritual about the work that you do?
It's such an important question, the idea of spirit. So the short answer is yes, but I want to put it into a context of what I mean by spirit. Spirituality, for many people, conjures up images of religion. That's a root, and that's a root for many people. I think about my mom. That has been a deep grounding for her, practicing Muslim, and that has been her faith since the time she was a little girl, and has helped her overcome and work through 2 civil wars and immigrating to small town North America, and trying to raise a family. That's been a rooting for her. I would like to extend that, and I like to think about spirituality from the broader definition of meaning making. How do we make meaning? How do we make sense of what's happening around us? And I'd say that that's the broader definition for me, and religion is one tool or methodology or way of thinking that helps us make meaning about why we're here, what our purpose is, what happens after death, why do bad things happen, and how do we deal and cope with them. I'm really inspired by the Buddhist tradition of really, can you see the beauty in the world, can you see the brutality in the world, and can you hold both those tensions because they're both real. And for me, I've had to make meaning of what I'm doing and why, because, there are just some days where it's completely overwhelming to wake up in the morning and hear more difficult news, more bombings, more racism, more sexism. And there are just days like, how do I put this into context? And sometimes the only way I can make meaning is by pulling myself back and going with the history, a 2,000-year version of history and the arc of humanity, and go, okay, right, we're getting better. There's some blips on the graph that go down, but ultimately the arc is actually upwards, towards more fairness. So that's how I make meaning of it. And everyone's invited to, at some point we have to learn to make meaning of it. And when we can make meaning of it, it helps. And research actually shows that people who can make meaning, put their experiences into context, actually recover more quickly. They've done research with prisoners of war and torture. And ultimately, people who've come through and are out the other side, frequently they've found a way to make meaning, and that meaning has actually helped ground them. Sometimes there's a wisdom that can come from people who come close to death, have really touched incredible hardship, and come out the other side. Mm-hmm. And so I think, and the research points towards the fact that it's one of the pieces is that they're able to somehow learn to put it into context, to make meaning of it.
Right. If you're just joining us, you're listening to A Spiritual Guide to Politics with my guest, Shakil Choudhry, who is talking about the path to deep diversity and making meaning of our lives. Just when you're talking about this meaning-making, it takes me back to the earlier point that you make about identity and fragility, that it seems like there is some solution to fragility if people were willing to take on the task of meaning-making in a serious way, of understanding. I think it would also, it seems to me, bridge a gap, too, in terms of compassion, because if I can make sense of my life and my experiences in a larger context, it means that I could make sense of someone else's life in that context. Isn't that true?
Yeah, and I think one of the things about living in a materialistic world, in a materialistic society, where hyper-capitalism and joy is only brought through purchase, that it's really hard to stop and to take the time to reflect on what the heck is happening to us,
yes,
and why, and what am I doing here? And we hardly have time in the structures that we live, which is part of the reason we have to change our structures. And I think that meaning-making is part of that. And if we come from the dominant group, to show up with compassion, and kind of go, right, there might be things here that I don't know about myself. 2, it's about the learning journey and actually understanding why different groups in society are where they are. What are the legacies of racism? And that's a knowledge journey. But as we encounter that knowledge journey, our emotions are going to come up because it's going to implicate us. And there's a stage in which we're going to feel like it's either my fault or my group's fault. I would say that's the stuff where people get hung up and then they stop learning and they don't want to go any further. So that's why the empathy piece, the compassion piece has to come in. And so the learning helps and the empathy helps. But then the self-awareness has got to help. Like our ability to regulate ourselves, because this stuff is difficult.
Yes.
We all have blind spots, things we cannot see about ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got to learn through those things. So it's the day-to-day things we've got to notice, the contradictions between our beliefs and our actions. And this is where the conscious and the unconscious divide have to be bridged. My work is around diversity and inclusion. I believe that the world's a better place when we work through our biases, but I noticed my biases. A few years ago, and it's a story I share in my book, I was getting some new glasses, and I was at the eyewear store, and they said, well, do you have an updated prescription? And I didn't. And they said, well, there's an optometrist just down the street, and they happened to have the optometrist card. As soon as I got this card, I looked at it, and I hesitated. And in my head, an immediate image came to mind of an older man, likely immigrant, likely couldn't speak English particularly well, in an old musty office somewhere. And I paused. It was a micro moment. It was that pause. And the pause was everything. Why did I hesitate? This was a referral. Now, interesting. That's my experience, given my name is Shakil Choudhry. And the name is the issue because I am 100% confident if that referral that the eyewear store had given me on that very plain business card was a white-sounding name, I wouldn't have hesitated. That's the personal work we've got to do, and realize that we've all got to look internally and notice those places where our day-to-day, our lived reality, and our beliefs might actually contradict. And if we can show up with compassion for that journey for ourselves, that's a big part of the way forward. And that requires the self-awareness. And that's where mindfulness can help us. But we've got to recognize that we all have these kinds of biases that have been socialized into us. Socialized such that a guy named Shakil Choudhry is now, making assumptions about someone named Abdeso Kianfar. Right? And so that's the socialization part. But we've got to recognize that that's also part of our neurobiology. We see the world in categories. Mm-hmm. We center some groups and we decenter other groups.
Yes.
We normalize people, and normal is incredibly powerful. And so more attention, more resources, benefit of the doubt, everything goes towards people who are more, quote-unquote, normal. But people we've been socialized to believe are not quite as normal as everybody else, those are the people, when they're sitting at a Starbucks waiting for a friend, then the manager is calling the cops on them.
Right.
And that's one part socialization and one part biological tendencies towards categorizing and othering people. So we've got to start looking within ourselves. And one of the basic principles of psychology is this. If I say, no, that doesn't happen within me, I've just given permission for it to grow. I just can't see it. So I invite your listeners, all of us, just as humans, as good people in the world, to not just look out for if I have contradictions or if my bias shows up, but to ask the courageous question of when and how does it show up? Because that actually challenges the fragility we carry within us.
That implicit unconscious bias that turns into a belief that gives rise to an action that is traumatizing, devastating. What an important thing to do, to catch the trigger in us and to recognize that it is at odds with what we believe.
We can create a greater sense of we, the better off we're all going to be.
I so appreciate that you've taken the time to talk to us today and to share this path of deep diversity.
Oh, well, you're really, really welcome, Liz. If people want to take a deeper dive into the deep diversity framework, our website is animaleadership.com. Look under Deep Diversity. The Deep Diversity Summer Institute will run August 22nd to 24th in my lovely hometown of Toronto.
Beautiful. That's great. You've been listening to A Spiritual Guide to Politics here on KPFK Radio. My name is Liz Philippos. Thank you so much for listening. I'm so glad you joined us. Until next time.